Lewis Hamilton wasn't beaten by raw pace in Hungary. He was beaten by 0.1 kilometers per hour. A speed difference smaller than most dashboard sensors can display ended up costing Ferrari a podium, extending Hamilton's championship deficit to 50 points and igniting another FIA controversy. But here's what almost everyone missed. The penalty wasn't the real disaster. The real damage had already happened several laps earlier. Ferrari arrived at the Hungaroring looking like the team to beat. Friday pace suggested the SF26 had finally unlocked its sweet spot on a circuit that rewards mechanical grip, stable rear balance, and efficient low-speed traction more than outright engine power. Hamilton qualified on the front row before a three-place grid penalty shuffled the order. Yet the race still offered a realistic route back to the podium. The championship fight was tightening. Mercedes looked vulnerable, and this was supposed to be Ferrari's statement before the summer break. But there's a catch. What the teams aren't telling us is that Hungary wasn't lost because Hamilton exceeded the pit lane limit by 0.1 kilometers per hour. It was lost through a chain of split-second decisions, delayed communication, and strategic calls that quietly opened the door for the FIA to intervene. One tiny mistake became another, until an entire Grand Prix unravelled. The real question is this: did Hamilton throw away the podium, or did Ferrari hand it away first? Before we move on, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe so you never miss out on any of our latest videos. Because once we uncover the hidden sequence of Ferrari's strategy calls, FIA timing data, and the overlooked radio messages, you'll see why this wasn't just another penalty. It was the moment Ferrari's entire Hungarian Grand Prix quietly fell apart. The first mistake actually happened before the lights even went out on Sunday. Ferrari had already compromised Hamilton's race on Saturday. The three-place grid penalty for impeding Oscar Piastri wasn't caused by reckless driving. It was triggered by a breakdown in communication. Frederic Vasseur openly admitted the team reacted too late in warning Hamilton that Piastri was approaching at full speed. That admission is far more significant than it first appears. In modern Formula One, drivers rely almost entirely on live information from the pit wall. The engineer is effectively the driver's second pair of eyes. Delay that information by even a second, and the consequences can be enormous. That grid penalty transformed the entire strategic landscape before the race had even begun. Instead of controlling the opening stint from the front row, Hamilton suddenly found himself trapped in turbulent air, surrounded by cars running different tyre strategies, and forced to spend valuable laps recovering positions rather than controlling tyre degradation. At the Hungaroring, where overtaking remains notoriously difficult despite recent circuit modifications, track position is often worth more than outright pace. Ferrari didn't merely lose 3 grid places, they surrendered strategic control. And that matters, because Ferrari genuinely looked like the quickest package throughout practice. Unlike Spa or Monza, Budapest rewards aerodynamic efficiency at lower speeds rather than sheer horsepower. The SF26's revised floor and suspension package appeared perfectly suited to the circuit's endless medium-speed direction changes. Hamilton repeatedly looked comfortable through Sector 2, where maintaining rear stability under traction is everything. Even rival teams admitted Ferrari were the benchmark on Friday. Then came qualifying. Hamilton narrowly missed pole, proving the speed was absolutely there. More importantly, Ferrari had finally placed themselves directly in the fight against Mercedes and McLaren instead of chasing them. This wasn't one of those weekends where Hamilton needed miracles. He simply needed clean execution. Instead, Ferrari immediately handed themselves unnecessary complications. Notice Vasseur's language after the race. He never blamed outright pace. He never claimed the car wasn't competitive. Instead, he repeatedly used words like execution, mistakes, and succession of errors. That wording tells us everything. Because inside Formula One, teams rarely criticize performance publicly unless they know the performance itself wasn't the issue. Execution was. And once execution begins to collapse, every following decision becomes reactive rather than proactive. That is exactly what unfolded on Sunday. The opening phase of the Grand Prix actually suggested Ferrari could still recover. Hamilton gradually climbed back into podium contention despite the compromised starting position. His tyre management looked controlled, Ferrari's pace remained competitive over longer stints, and Kimi Antonelli wasn't disappearing into the distance. The championship picture was still very much alive. Then, the race entered its most politically fascinating moment. Oscar Piastri suddenly stopped on circuit. A virtual safety car was deployed. To most viewers, this simply looked like another routine neutralization. To strategists, however, it was the single most important decision point of the afternoon. Virtual safety cars are often described as cheap pit stops. That phrase massively understates their importance. Under VSC conditions, every car slows to a controlled delta time while the pit lane continues operating normally. Because the rest of the field is travelling significantly slower, the relative time loss from making a pit stop is dramatically reduced. Sometimes teams can save 10 seconds or more compared with stopping under green flag conditions. Naturally, every strategist immediately reaches for the same question: pit or stay out? Ferrari chose to pit both Hamilton and Charles Leclerc almost instantly. On paper, the decision appeared logical. Fresh tyres, reduced pit loss, attack until the finish. Except Formula One strategy is never judged on paper. It is judged against traffic, against timing, against track position, and against what your rivals are likely to do next. Hamilton immediately questioned the call after the race, admitting he would never have chosen to stop if the decision had been his alone. His reasoning was brutally simple. He believed his tyres still had enough life remaining to defend track position. Yes, Max Verstappen probably would have caught him eventually on fresher rubber, but third place remained highly achievable, possibly even second. Instead, Ferrari voluntarily surrendered the one asset Hungary values above almost everything else: track position. That single strategic choice completely changed Hamilton's afternoon before he even reached the pit limiter. Now here's the detail almost nobody noticed. Hamilton didn't simply drive into the pit lane under pressure. He entered the pit lane immediately after a sequence of rapidly changing instructions, with almost no time to question Ferrari's call. He later admitted the message came just before pit entry, leaving him with only one realistic option: trust the pit wall. That's the hidden pressure modern Formula One drivers rarely talk about. At nearly 300 km per hour, approaching the pit entry while monitoring the VSC delta, brake balance, steering switches, tyre temperatures, and traffic behind. There is no committee meeting inside the cockpit. There is only instinct. Ferrari made the decision. Hamilton executed it. And that execution is where everything spiraled. Listen carefully to Frederic Vasseur's explanation after the race. Rather than blaming Hamilton outright, he described what happened as a succession of mistakes. That phrase is incredibly revealing because it recognizes Formula One errors rarely happen in isolation. One small problem creates another until the entire operation begins chasing itself. According to Vasseur, Hamilton slightly locked a wheel entering the pit box, costing Ferrari a couple of tenths during the stop. Those lost tenths may sound insignificant, but Formula One drivers instantly try to recover any lost time the moment they leave their pit box. Not by driving recklessly, by driving perfectly. Perfectly means accelerating to the absolute legal limit before engaging the pit lane speed limiter at precisely the right moment. The margin is microscopic, and this is where another forgotten FIA regulation completely changes the story. Many long-time fans still believe drivers are allowed to exceed the pit lane speed limit by almost 1 km/h before receiving a penalty. Years ago, that was effectively true because the accepted tolerance was considerably larger. Teams became so confident in exploiting that margin that they deliberately calibrated their systems right on the edge. The FIA eventually decided enough was enough. The tolerance was dramatically reduced. Suddenly, what used to be acceptable became punishable. That's why Hamilton's recorded speed looks almost unbelievable. Officially, he was measured at 80.1 km/h in an 80 km/h pit lane. Vasseur later revealed an even more astonishing detail. Internally, Ferrari believed the effective tolerance extended only to around 80.05 km/h, while Hamilton's release registered roughly 80.06 km/h before rounding. That is the difference between remaining on the podium and receiving a 5-second penalty. Anthony Davidson admitted during the broadcast that he struggled to understand why the penalty had been issued until the FIA published the telemetry afterwards. Once the numbers became public, the regulations were actually straightforward. The car exceeded the permitted limit. The punishment was automatic. No discretion, no negotiation, no consideration for championship context. This is where public perception and sporting regulations begin travelling in completely different directions. Fans immediately compared Hamilton's punishment with Carlos Sainz receiving the same 5-second penalty after colliding with Oscar Piastri. Social media exploded with one obvious question. How can 0.1 km/h carry exactly the same race penalty as causing contact with another driver? Emotionally, the criticism makes perfect sense. Technically, however, the FIA treats these incidents through completely different regulatory frameworks. Pit lane speeding is governed by objective measurement. Either the speed exceeds the limit or it doesn't. There is virtually no subjective interpretation involved. Racing incidents, meanwhile, require the stewards to evaluate intent, available space, avoidance opportunities, shared responsibility, and sporting consequences before determining responsibility. Two identical 5-second penalties, two completely different legal processes. The optics looked terrible. But the regulations remained internally consistent. The bigger political problem wasn't necessarily the FIA. It was that Ferrari had placed Hamilton in a position where this microscopic error could decide his afternoon at all. Hamilton himself admitted exactly that after climbing from the car. If we hadn't stopped, the penalty never happens. One sentence, one devastating admission. Because suddenly, the discussion shifts away from whether the FIA were too harsh. Instead, attention turns towards Ferrari. Did the team create the conditions for their own disaster? And once you start asking that question, the entire Hungarian Grand Prix begins looking less like an officiating controversy, and far more like an operational collapse, hiding behind one incredibly unlucky number. 0.1 km/h, and the consequences extended far beyond losing one position to Charles Leclerc. When Hamilton crossed the finish line, he believed he had salvaged 4th place after an afternoon spent recovering from Saturday's grid penalty. 5 seconds later, that recovery vanished. He was officially classified 5th, Leclerc inherited 4th, and the championship mathematics suddenly became far more uncomfortable. Before Budapest, Hamilton was already chasing Kimi Antonelli. After Budapest, the gap stretched to 50 points. That number matters because Formula One championships are rarely lost through one catastrophic weekend. They disappear through repeated losses of 5 points here, 3 points there, and one strategic error after another until the arithmetic quietly becomes overwhelming. Hamilton himself admitted exactly that. He described Hungary as the type of race where championships are lost. Notice he didn't say, "Today the championship was lost." He said races like this are where championships disappear. That wording reveals a driver who understands the bigger picture. One false start at Silverstone, one collision penalty at Spa, one qualifying impeding penalty in Budapest, one pit lane speeding penalty on Sunday. Individually, none of those incidents destroys a title campaign. Together, they create momentum. And momentum in Formula One works both ways. While Ferrari accumulated penalties, Mercedes accumulated points. That contrast is perhaps the most painful statistic from Hungary. Mercedes didn't enjoy a perfect weekend either. George Russell suffered an anti-stall issue at the start. Antonelli had already received his own qualifying penalty for failing to slow sufficiently under yellow flags. On paper, Mercedes should have been vulnerable. Instead, they escaped Budapest with another podium. Ferrari arrived as favourites. Mercedes left with the bigger championship advantage. That is operational efficiency. Toto Wolff's reaction after the race was particularly revealing. Even though Mercedes had experienced their own problems, he admitted he was genuinely surprised Ferrari failed to capitalise. His comments carried the tone of a rival who expected Ferrari to score heavily, only to watch them unravel through self-inflicted mistakes. In Formula One, rivals often tell you more than teammates ever will. When your biggest competitor is shocked that you failed to beat them, that's usually a sign the opportunity was real. The Constructors' Championship tells the same story. Mercedes now sit on 379 points. Ferrari remain on 307, a deficit of 72 points, despite Ferrari arguably producing one of the quickest race cars over several recent weekends. Speed isn't separating these teams anymore. Execution is, and that's arguably a far more dangerous weakness. Because finding 0.2 of lap time through aerodynamic upgrades is difficult but measurable. Engineers know where to search. Wind tunnels, CFD simulations, suspension geometry and floor development all provide clear pathways. Fixing human execution is much harder. How do you eliminate delayed radio calls? How do you prevent split-second strategic hesitation? How do you guarantee flawless pit stops under immense pressure? There isn't a software update for that. There isn't a new front wing for that. There is only discipline. That's why Vasseur's frustration after the race sounded so raw. He wasn't angry because Ferrari lacked performance. He was angry because the team wasted performance they already possessed. His verdict was brutally honest. Everything went wrong. Not one thing, everything. The starts, the qualifying communication, the pit execution, the strategy, the pit lane penalty. When a team principal publicly lists failures across multiple departments instead of protecting the organisation with carefully chosen corporate language, it usually means internal conversations are even tougher behind closed doors. And perhaps that's the biggest revelation from Hungary. The FIA may dominate the headlines because penalties generate outrage. Fans debate steward consistency. Social media argues over whether 0.1 kilometers per hour deserves 5 seconds. Radio messages go viral. But beneath all that noise sits a far more uncomfortable truth. Ferrari didn't lose this weekend because the FIA suddenly became stricter. Ferrari lost because they repeatedly placed themselves in situations where the FIA had no choice but to enforce the regulations. Let us know your verdict in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe because the second half of the season could expose an even bigger Ferrari story.